On March 4th, 2025, a pickup truck limped into my shop with the owner riding the clutch like he was afraid the engine would quit at the next stop sign. He said it started a few weeks ago. A little hesitation off the line. Then a rough idle at red lights. Then, last Tuesday, it almost stalled pulling out of his own driveway. He had already been to 2 shops. One replaced his spark plugs. The other replaced his throttle body. $600 later, the truck still shook at idle and still lost power the second he pressed the gas pedal past halfway. Today, I am revealing the small valve hiding under your intake manifold that most drivers have never heard of, the one responsible for stolen power, rough idle, and stalling that 2 shops in a row completely missed. I want you to understand something before we go any further. This is not a rare part. It is not some exotic upgrade. It exists on almost every gasoline and diesel engine built in the last 30 years. It sits quietly, doing its job for years without a single complaint, and then one day it starts choking your engine from the inside, and almost nobody thinks to look at it first. That truck sitting in my bay was not suffering from worn spark plugs or a dirty throttle body. Those parts were fine. The real problem was buried in a spot most drivers, and apparently a couple of technicians, never bother to check. A small valve bolted between the exhaust manifold and the intake manifold, caked solid with carbon, stuck in a position it was never supposed to hold. I want to be clear about something right away. This valve is not a design flaw. It is not a scam part manufacturers added to make your life difficult. It is one of the most important emissions components in your entire engine, and when it works correctly, you never notice it exists. That is exactly the problem. It fails silently, and by the time you feel it, you have usually been losing power and fuel economy for months. Here is what almost nobody explains to you. Your engine was never designed to burn fuel as hot as possible. Extreme heat inside the combustion chamber creates a byproduct called nitrogen oxide, and that byproduct is one of the harshest pollutants your car produces. So engineers built a system to cool down combustion temperatures on purpose, not by changing the fuel, not by changing the spark, but by recycling a small amount of exhaust gas back into the intake stream. That exhaust gas has already been burned. It carries almost no oxygen. When it mixes with fresh air entering the cylinder, it acts like a thermal buffer, lowering peak combustion temperature and cutting nitrogen oxide emissions dramatically. The part that controls exactly how much of that exhaust gas gets recycled and exactly when is called the exhaust gas recirculation valve. Most people just call it the EGR valve, and most drivers have driven their entire lives without knowing it exists. Think about where this valve lives. It sits directly between 2 of the hottest, dirtiest environments in your entire engine bay. The exhaust manifold, where soot, unburned fuel, and carbon particles are constantly flowing, and the intake manifold, where oil vapor from the crankcase ventilation system is often present as well. Every single time that valve opens, it is bathing itself in exhaust soot. Every single time oil vapor drifts through the intake side, a little more residue gets baked onto the valve's moving parts. This is not damage from a defect. This is exposure from doing exactly the job it was built to do, over and over, for years, until deposits start to win. On older vehicles, this valve was controlled by engine vacuum, a simple diaphragm that pulled open when vacuum signal told it to. On most modern vehicles, it is electronically controlled, a small stepper motor driven directly by the engine computer, often with a built-in position sensor so the computer knows exactly how far open the valve actually is. Either design does the same basic job. Either design accumulates the same carbon buildup over time. And either design can fail in one of 2 opposite directions. And this is the part that surprises people the most. This valve does not just fail closed, it can fail stuck open just as easily, and each failure feels completely different behind the wheel. When the valve gets clogged and can no longer open properly, the engine computer commands EGR flow that never actually arrives. Combustion temperatures creep upward because that cooling exhaust gas is missing. You might notice pinging or light knocking under load, a subtle shudder you can't quite place during acceleration, and slowly worsening fuel economy. The system diagnostic code most associated with this condition is P0401, insufficient EGR flow, and it typically shows up during load and cruising conditions rather than at idle, because the valve barely opens at idle in the first place. Now flip the failure the other direction. When carbon buildup causes the valve to stick partially open, or the pintle no longer seats correctly, exhaust gas keeps leaking into the intake even when the computer wants the valve fully closed. This is the version that causes the dramatic symptoms drivers actually complain about. A rough, uneven idle, a stall at a stoplight, hesitation the instant you press the gas from a stop. Idle is exactly when the engine wants little to no EGR flow, so any exhaust gas leaking in at that moment dilutes the air-fuel mixture right when the engine has the least room to compensate. The diagnostic code tied to this condition is P0402, excessive EGR flow, and it is far more likely to be the reason your engine idles like it wants to quit. Here is the part that catches drivers off guard. Neither of these situations always triggers a warning light. Mild to moderate EGR restriction can exist for a long time without setting a hard code, especially on vehicles where the computer is tolerant of gradual drift. Your engine can be running with a partially choked EGR system for months, feeling sluggish, feeling rough, burning more fuel than it should, and your dashboard stays completely dark the entire time. That is exactly why the truck sitting in my bay had already visited 2 other shops. No consistent code, no obvious smoking gun, just a driver who insisted something felt wrong, and 2 technicians who chased the symptoms they could measure quickly instead of the part hiding underneath the intake manifold. This is where I need to be honest about something the repair industry does not like to talk about. A carbon-caked EGR valve rarely announces itself clearly on a scan tool. It takes an actual test, commanding the valve open with a scanner while watching idle revolutions per minute drop, or physically removing the valve and looking at the pintle and the seat with your own eyes. That takes time. Replacing a throttle body or a set of spark plugs is faster, easier to bill, and easier to explain to a customer standing at the counter. So symptoms like rough idle and hesitation get treated as generic tune-up items instead of what they actually are: a symptom of one specific, identifiable, and usually inexpensive part failing exactly the way it is expected to fail over time. When I finally pulled that truck's EGR valve off the intake, I did not need a lab to tell me what was wrong. The pintle, the small conical tip that seats against the valve opening to seal exhaust flow, was coated in a black tar-like crust almost a quarter-inch thick. It was not seating flush anymore. It was propped open by its own buildup, leaking exhaust into the intake at idle exactly when the engine needed it closed. I did not need to replace a single sensor. I did not need a new throttle body. I needed a can of carburetor cleaner, a brass wire brush, and about 45 minutes. If you suspect this valve is behind your own rough idle, hesitation, or mystery power loss, the diagnosis does not require a professional lift. Start with a visual check. On most vehicles, the EGR valve sits on or near the intake manifold, connected by a metal tube or passage running from the exhaust side of the engine. It is usually round, often with an electrical connector on top if it is electronically controlled, or a vacuum hose fitting if it is the older style. With the engine off and cool, you can often see it without removing anything else. If you have a code reader capable of bidirectional commands, you can command the EGR valve open while the engine idles. On a healthy system, commanding it open should cause a noticeable idle stumble or stall, because you are intentionally flooding the intake with exhaust gas the engine was not expecting. If commanding the valve open does nothing at all, that is a strong sign the valve is stuck, clogged, or not responding, and it deserves a closer look. Some vehicles, particularly older Fords, also use a separate differential pressure feedback EGR sensor to measure flow indirectly, and that sensor can develop its own problems worth checking at the same time. Once you have the valve out, the fix is almost always simpler than people expect. Let the engine cool completely before you start. The bolts holding this valve on live right next to exhaust components that get scorching hot, and working on them while everything is still warm is how you strip a bolt or burn yourself. Once it is cool, unbolt the valve and take a look at the pintle and the seat. If you see a thick, dry, tar-like coating, you are looking at your problem. Soak the valve in carburetor or throttle body cleaner for 20 to 30 minutes before you even pick up a brush. Heavy carbon deposits do not respond well to force. They respond to dwell time, letting the solvent soften the buildup before you scrub. After soaking, use a brass brush. Never a wire wheel or anything that can scratch the sealing surface, and clean the pintle, the seat, and the internal passages until you can see bare metal again. Do not use anything abrasive enough to change the shape of the sealing surface, because that seat needs to close perfectly flush, or you will trade one leak for another. Reinstall the valve with a new gasket. This is not optional. These valves seal against extreme temperature swings, and an old, compressed, or damaged gasket will leak exhaust and vacuum exactly where you do not want it, undoing the entire cleaning job. Torque the mounting bolts evenly in a crisscross pattern rather than cranking down one side first, the same way you would with any component sealing against a flat surface. On most vehicles, a full EGR valve cleaning costs you nothing but a can of cleaner and less than an hour of your time. If the valve itself is cracked, if the stepper motor has failed internally, or if the pintle shaft is worn and no longer seals even after cleaning, replacement is the honest answer, and a quality replacement valve typically runs somewhere in the range of $80 to $250 depending on the vehicle, well under what that truck had already spent chasing the wrong parts. After the valve goes back in, do not expect instant perfection. The engine computer has likely been adapting fuel trims and idle behavior around the restricted or leaking flow for weeks or months. Give it a short drive cycle that includes some idle time, some steady cruising, and a bit of moderate acceleration, and let the computer relearn against a system that is finally behaving the way it was designed to. On that truck, the rough idle was gone before I even pulled it out of the bay. Throttle response came back within the first mile. The owner called me 2 days later just to say it felt like a different vehicle, and the only thing that changed was a part he never knew he had. Here is what I want you to walk away with. This valve does not fail because your car is old or because you did something wrong. It fails because it sits directly in the crossfire between hot exhaust soot and oil vapor, doing an unglamorous job that keeps your engine within emissions limits and running smoothly at the same time. Left unchecked for long enough, carbon buildup will eventually restrict it or hold it open at the worst possible moments. That process does not happen overnight. It happens gradually, so gradually that most drivers describe it as their car just getting old instead of recognizing it as one specific, identifiable, and fixable part slowly losing its grip. You do not need to wait for a stall in your own driveway to take this seriously. If your engine hesitates off the line, if idle feels lumpy or inconsistent, if fuel economy has quietly dropped without an obvious cause, or if you occasionally hear light pinging under load, this valve deserves a look before you authorize anything more expensive. A 5-minute inspection can save you from paying for a throttle body, a set of sensors, or a full tune-up that was never going to fix the actual problem. And if you drive a vehicle with more than 60,000 miles on it and cannot remember this valve ever being touched, do not wait for symptoms to force the issue. A little carburetor cleaner and a brass brush now is a lot cheaper than the diagnostic runaround that truck went through before it landed in my bay. If this showed you a part of your engine you never knew existed, hit like, so more drivers see it before they pay for parts they never needed. Subscribe. If you want the hidden components inside your engine explained the same honest way, one video at a time. And if a shop ever replaced something on your car that turned out to be the wrong fix, tell that story in the comments, because the part that actually needed attention is usually smaller, cheaper, and quieter than anyone expects.